The themes of the festival have been from day one. Most of you have been here before, so you know that we've taken a lot of inspiration from this line, this phrase by a poet of Goan origin whose name is Eunice D'Souza, a very great poet, one of the best poets in the English language of our times, I think. And she's written this poem, this phrase called Ways of Belonging, different ways of belonging. This was something that was very much on our minds when we started this festival. We didn't want to, we don't have any, we don't have any major corporate sponsors. These are here more tokenistically than anything else. We don't have brand manager, event manager, nothing like that. We are very much homegrown. It's volunteer driven by a bunch of writers and artists and poets from Goa who are constantly interrogating, thinking about this idea of how do we belong? Where do we belong? Why is it that when you talk about mainstream narratives in India, why is it when you talk about Indian history, Indian culture, somehow we always fall out of it. We never fit into those narratives. And by we, I mean a very broad we, encompassing all the different strands of Goan identity and Goan culture. But the reason we started the festival is we discovered that there were many other parts of India actually, and across the border, which had that same feeling. So from day one, the festival has been built around regions like the northeast of India, like Kashmir, like Goa, of course, always centrally Goa, which have ambivalent ways of belonging to the dominant strands of the Indian narrative. And over time, we've expanded that and found tremendous value in reaching out directly across the borders to Sri Lanka, to Bangladesh, to Nepal, to Pakistan. And again, we invite many people to come from those countries. And generally, some come. This year, we are extremely proud to have a strong Bangladesh focus. So that's one thing. The other strand that's always been part of this festival is this question of finding a voice. Because we are developing a literary and critical culture here in Goa, again, a post-colonial one. And many people, we have a plethora of fantastic talent here in Goa, but people often have a problem finding that voice, finding that position. And this is something that it's ironic because many of the greatest artists and writers from around India and the world, around Pamuk to give you an example, come here and they spend a very productive months of their lives writing here or working here. But yet somehow the Goans or people who inhabit Goa most of the year having a bit of a problem, have had historically a bit of a problem getting to the point where they can write their own books or express themselves in the same kinds of fora that they should have available to them. I think over the course of the last 6 years, this festival has seen a dramatic change in that. We have a huge publishing and scholarly industry now, and all of those trends also come back here. But besides those general themes, one thing that has been dominant in the thinking and the reasoning for this festival, we're different from others, is that this idea of the paradigm of the family gathering. This is something that's been very profoundly grounded in Damodar Mauzo and my thinking from day one. Family, obviously, a Goan family, this is the time of the year where Goan families come get together, and the other times, Diwali also. And families come from all over the world, and they include all kinds of different people. And they include, nowadays, you have family members who come from every corner of the planet, and you have family members who are not at all traditional. And I think all of those things come together, which leads me to this session. And so the Goa Arts and Literary Festival has been around for 6 years. And this is the first time we are welcoming someone who we're very proud of in the family back to the festival. So, Anjali, thank you so much for coming. And we started the festival. Anjali Arondekar is an absolutely wonderful scholar. I'm not going to read out her entire bio, which is here, but I strongly urge you to read the Navin Times interview, which is posted outside, which is a wonderful way to start the festival. And this session work comes a little bit out of our work. I'm very excited for our upcoming work. We also have with us a member of the family who's been around for a while and doesn't really need an introduction from me. Albertina Almeida is someone who does such valuable work in a number of spheres. She is also, I must say, someone who never stops positioning things correctly. I always get a lot of wisdom from her interventions in the popular media. I urge you also to follow her. And also Ferrao. I don't think you had a PhD when you first started coming to this festival, Benny. he's now a distinguished fellow at William and Mary in the US. And he's someone who is stealthily rewriting the American curriculum to suit our tastes. So I congratulate you for that, Benny. So that's my very lengthy introduction. Thank you so much. This is very suitable beginning to our festival. Very proud of it. Thank you so much.
So Vivek, how much time do we have? Because we started 15 minutes.
You have
till 11?
Yeah.
Welcome everyone. First I should say that as people who work on sexuality and gender, we don't believe in any right or wrong position. So I want to just correct you on that front. We thought we would run this more as a conversation given the paucity of time, and if we have some time we'd love to hear from you a little bit. My name is Anjali Arondekar. I work on the history of sexuality in Maharashtra and Goa, and I'm currently writing a book about caste and sexuality via the history of the Gomantak Maratha Samaj, who many of you here know primarily through Benedito, the first Chief Minister of liberated Goa. So let me say a little bit about why we call the panel Telling Tales, and then I'm going to try to work it around so that we can each have something to say. We thought we would call the panel Telling Tales because we wanted to think about the stories, the fictions, the mythologies, the histories through which sexuality and gender become visible, both in the media and historically, particularly in a state like Goa. What are the forms through which they appear? What are the stories that they get connected to? And what are the stories that we don't see? Right? So one of the things we want to also emphasize that when we say sexuality and gender, we are not just talking about women, we're not just talking about alternative sexualities, either queers, gays, lesbians, transgender, we're also talking about masculinity, we're talking about different kinds of gender formation, right? So the first thing we want to do is leave aside what we in the business call foundational critique, meaning we're not going around looking for gays, we're not going around looking for women, and we certainly don't want to rescue anyone. Right? What we want to do with you today is get you to roll up your sleeves and think about how do you think about sexuality and gender. Now I'm going to say a few things and then I'll pass it along. Albertina is our native informant because she does the hard work that none of us are brave enough to do. Bene will be speaking about sexuality and gender in the work he does in the Goan diaspora, and I will be talking about Goa's past very briefly. So one of the things I want to say is that most of you read the newspaper or you wouldn't be here. And one of the things that you've noticed, I'm sure, are the debates around tolerance and intolerance. That everywhere you go, people are talking about this. And one of the biggest foci in these debates is sexuality, right? Whether it's policing of women's sexuality, whether it's Section 377, whether it's the new law that recognizes third gender and yet doesn't allow them to have sex. There are all kinds of ways in which sexuality is now in the media. But I want to call your attention to a very, very specific way in which we think about sexuality and gender, which is through the use of the past, right? So if you listen to our friends in the RSS or the Bhajap, sexuality is a singular story of the past where we were all Hindu, we were all untarnished, we were all chaste, basically didn't have any fun. And then you have the left, which says, no, sexuality was diverse, it was multiple, it was all over the place. Right? That it's impossible to recover one singular history of sexuality. So currently there's a war going on between these two sides, and historical research is very central to this argument. And if we don't pay attention to the ways in which history is being used in our name, particularly when it comes to volatile questions like sexuality, we tend to cede ground to the very debates that we're trying to overcome. I want to just point one simple thing, and then I'm going to turn it over to Bene and Albertina, is for example, I work, as I said, on the history of the Gomantak Maratha Samaj. The Gomantak Maratha Samaj is a community of Goan Devadasis. They were not just Kalavans who did very well in the music and other artistic circles. They were also sex workers. They were attached to Devasthans. They did multiple labor. They were also indentured slaves on land. Those are the kinds of histories that when we talk about the Gomantak Maratha Samaj, people don't want to hear about. We want to celebrate the legacy of Dayanand Bandorkar, but we don't want to talk about the fact that his grandmothers, great-grandmothers were Devadasis, right? So what does that do to our embrace of Goan history? It makes Goan history very centrally about sexuality. It makes it very centrally about gender. All right, let me turn it over to Bene.
I'm a bit disappointed, Anjali, to hear that our panel isn't going to be looking for the gays and the lesbians and the transgenders.
We'll take phone numbers.
Because they often tend to be the most fun people in the books I research. So I just got done teaching a course called Portuguese India, Lost Texts, Found Worlds at William and Mary in Virginia. And in the process of teaching the course, I was asked to do a guest lecture in a different class, and one of my former students was in this class, and during the Q&A, she said something to the effect of, yeah, in Benet's class, we always talk about race and sex. And it kind of caught me unawares, but it kind of speaks to this thing you're talking about how sexuality is always happening, whether it's in the background or in the foreground of the histories that we work with. And I think that Goan literature does phenomenal work in terms of gender and sexuality, and unfortunately, it's something that's rather understudied in Goa itself. I often think about how applicable the curriculum I write for the courses I teach in the States would be here in Goa itself. As you know, one of the books that I work on is Skin by Margaret Mascarenhas, which talks about the history of slavery in Portuguese India. And what's revelatory about the book is it not only uncovers the past in terms of Africans being in Goa, but I think it also questions the ways in which we think about race in Goa. So it's very easy for us to think of Africans as being Africans in India who are collectively called Siddhis as being mixed race, right? Meaning partially South Asian. But then what that also should open up for us is that the South Asians in Goa are possibly part African as well. And I think that if we were to discuss sexuality and gender seriously, we would also think about the ways in which it intersects with raciality.
I would also just add one thing to Benet's comment, and I'll be very curious to hear what Albertina has to say, is as someone who works in the past, I'm incredibly frustrated by the lack of work in vernacular languages in Goa. There is a plethora of material in Marathi, in Konkani, in Kannada, which was also a script that was used in the past. Most of the work that we read is still restricted to the Portuguese sources, and I would urge those of you who are just embarking on research to embrace the massive archives we have here locally.
Friends, sorry, I have a little bit of a sort of bad throat. You have to excuse me for this. When Anjali told me about this session, the first thing that I thought of is a little experience I had when I was in Chennai for a couple of months. It was the first time I was away from Goa and I was living in some other area, and I was confronted with something like a question. I used to live quite close to what is called the Loyola College there, and I was like, and I was wearing a skirt and blouse. In those days, in Chennai, everybody wore what are called half saris or whatever. So they said, some boys came up to me and they said, "Oh, where are you from?" So I said, "I'm from Goa." And then they said, "So you all have boyfriends, like?" So I said, "What does that mean?" "No, you have boyfriends, like." And I was in a fix. I mean, do I say yes or do I say no? Because if I say no, I'm trying to say that Goans are asexual or something like that. And if I say yes, I'm like promoting a certain stereotype that Goan women are all about having boyfriends or about or girlfriends. Yeah. So my dilemma began at that point of time, because it's all an issue of representation. How women here are projected, how women in Goa are projected to the rest of the world. And the point was like, you're constantly, you don't want to deny that women in Goa have like every woman has sexuality. And at the same time, you don't want it to be commodified. And this thought stayed with me, and until today, we find ourselves in this kind of conundrum where you kind of have to steer clear of that commodification at the same time you have got to, make it clear that we are not falling into that bracket because of denying women's sexuality. So this is something I've till today been grappling with, and more so we find this more of a concern in these times where you have ministers' wives who say, well, dresses breed rape, or going to a convent school breeds rape. As if rape occurs because of that. So these kinds of images, about sexuality, which and about conflating sexuality with sexual violence. I think this is something that we need to think about, because these are two different things. Sexuality is one thing and sexual violence is different. But it's almost as if someone expresses their sexuality, and sexuality in a way that is not acceptable, then that becomes an invitation for sexual violence.
Perhaps what we can do is give an example of how we see some of these questions working out, so you have a sense of how this translates into our work. So I'll start by giving you an example of a case I'm working on right now to give you a sense of what we mean by telling stories. So I'm working on a case right now which was filed in 1911 in Bombay called The Evil Ladies of Girgaon, which coincidentally happened to be Goanese, right? And these evil ladies of Girgaon there's a complaint filed against them by the Girgaon Taxpayers Association, who are basically landlords who are mainly Saraswat Brahmins from Goa, who have migrated to Kotajiwadi in Girgaon. And they have filed a complaint with the Commissioner of Police saying these evil ladies of Girgaon need to be evicted from these houses because they are bringing evil and prostitution to our neighborhood. Now, any one of you who have done any historical work know this is a very familiar form. It's an early version of what you're speaking about, right? That A, because they are Devadasis, B, because they are from Goa, they must necessarily be evil and prostitutes. But when you started to work on this case, what I found out was, first and foremost, these evil ladies of Girgaon were evil not because they were sex workers, which they were, but because they occupied prime real estate in the thoroughfares of Girgaon. So the taxpayers didn't really care whether they were prostitutes or not. In fact, the Commissioner of Police very sarcastically says in a note to them, to the taxpayers, that I've seen many of you in their houses and you make complaints only in the monsoon when nothing else is going on, right? But his point is that sexuality is really not the thing that you're stressed out about. You're stressed out because these women occupy these prime real estates in Girgaon, which is now called Hughes Road, which was the place through which these taxpayers could get a seat on the municipal corporation. Now, what happens when you think about histories of sexuality as cover stories, right? As appearing to be about one thing, but then allowing us to link it to histories of capital, histories of property, histories of urbanization. These are the kinds of things that we would sort of urge you to think about. And I think, Albertina, you were heading that way.
I just like to say that for me this resonates because this is exactly what happened at Baina. A couple of years ago, that was I think in 2004, there were these massive evictions at Baina, and the cover was like that we want to clean the place of prostitution, but actually it was about the privatization of the Mormugaon Port Trust, the introduction of marinas, and a whole lot of development which would evict a whole lot of people from the area, but they had to do it part by part. So they start with the first area, which was partly what is called a red light area. So they say we want to clean the area of prostitution. So they get a middle class public opinion approval, and then they evict them. Then now they are gone. So the others won't combine with these because they feel they might lose out if they combine. So then the next lot is the trawler owners and the Kariwada people who we hear about in the newspapers today. So you kind of segregate you kind of categorize and separate out various marginalized sections like the fishing community, etc. And therefore, in that sense, you use the trump card of what you call prostitution or to evict to kind of evict the people so that you can get the land back. And everybody knows that most of Vasco, irrespective of whether it's on the coastline or elsewhere, most of Vasco is occupation on government land. So it's not about illegal occupations only by these people, if illegal occupations is an issue. So clearly this was about evictions in the name of cleaning up the area of prostitution.
I like this idea of the cover story, and I think that the work that both of you do is about digging behind the scenes. And I'm thinking here also of your article in Differences, Anjali, where you did a little bit of, actually quite a bit of literary research. And there was this one, was it a novella, a short story about this young man that was raised by several different women?
So the Gomantak Mahara Samaj, which was established in 1929, publishes a monthly publication that started in 1929, continues to this day. It was called the Samaj Sudharak. It is now called the Goman Sharga. I urge you to go to the Samaj archives. They're open to everyone. They will offer you a cup of tea and help you to find anything there. So these pieces around all these young men, as we said, our conversations are obviously not just about women and alternative sexualities, they're also about different kinds of masculinity. So the story that Bene is referring to is written by a young man who is writing in the Samaj Sudharak in 1916 and saying, the piece is called Matru Devata Kiva Matru Prem. And the piece is about why should I be forced to love my mother? Right? Because the Gomantak Mahara Samaj is formed of Devadasis whose children take on the surnames of their yajmans, their patrons. So you have a lot of people running around Goa with surnames that are Brahmin, who are not really Brahmin, they are members of the Gomantak Mahara Samaj. To give you an example, if you go to Karnataka, the Gomantak Mahara Samaj is called the Saraswat Samaj. So when I was doing research there, I went over there and asked the Chickneys, the secretary, I'm like, what are you guys doing? If you say Saraswat Samaj, people are going to think you're Saraswat, and you're obviously not. And he said, no, we are followers of the goddess Saraswati. So why cannot we be called Saraswat Samaj? So that for me is the kala of history, that you think outside of Kalavans, right? Why just think about Kalavans through singing and dancing? Of course that's important, but the kala that this Samaj has spreads through the ways in which they chose to document their histories, etc., etc. I could bore you forever, but I know Bene had a different point. So.
Well, no, but it leads to my observation that the work both of you are doing is saying that basically, look, you're trying to cover up these stories and they're not going away, they're there for discovery, right? I was in London just a few months ago and I found this book at the Goan, it was a Goan festival where there were 2 bookstores and about 50 food stalls. And I'll leave you to draw your own conclusions about that. But it's The Dewdrop Inn by Leslie de Noronha, who is a gay man, gay Goan writer, and probably one of the earliest books in English, I think, from Goa or by a Goan writer, where he actually talks about gay life in Bombay, I think in the 60s or 70s or something like this. And similarly, I think that there's other works that we need to look at, both as a community, as scholars, or scholars of history and so on. The work of Violet Diaz-Lanoy, who is friends with Richard Wright and James Baldwin, who were civil rights activists in Black America in the 60s. Violet Diaz-Lanoy's work came into being because Richard Wright, an African American, championed her work. And what's really compelling about her work is that she was mounting a critique of Gandhi after having worked with him, prior to the current moment where lots of histories are being revealed about Gandhi's past and the possibilities of his being a repressed homosexual and a pervert and so on and so forth, all very interesting kinds of things. Now here was a Goan woman who was observing Gandhi from the margins, where she was both, she thought of herself as being Goan, Indian and African. And she was sort of like, at the intersection of this, looking from the outside, as it were, and offering commentary. But what was also really revealing about her work was, even as she was a staunch Gandhian for a moment, she also had lots of things to say about Zionism in Israel, for example. And so she was connecting these histories across borders. What's very compelling about Pears from the Willow Tree, the only novel I think that was actually published by her, it was discovered after, or published posthumously, if I'm not mistaken, is there's lots of discussions about sexuality as a metaphor for the state and its relationship with people. And I think that this is really revealing, and it's very compelling because it's by a Goan woman who's reflecting on history and on her community at multiple sides of the globe.
When you talk of metaphor for the state, I was just reminded about some time ago, one of the MLAs, he said, well, Goa's, I mean, he happened to be in the opposition, so he said, Goa's becoming a rape capital. So, you know, and this word is played around in different ways. One is, at one level, yes, again, you know the dilemmas. We don't want to deny the existence of rape. At the same time, we do not want also that somebody says that a place is a rape capital as a way to induce a travel advisory that people should not come to Goa. You know, because you also have competition in tourism. So we have to acknowledge realities. We have to acknowledge that we are dealing with that. That these realities are not being dealt with in terms of sexual violence. But what I'm trying to say is that always something sexual, as Anjali clearly said, this is always so connected to economics. You know, so you know this is used here in this context to either downplay a government. You know, it's so connected to economics and politics. So it's downplaying a government at one level, and on the other level, it's about ensuring that there are travel advisories which will make sure that people don't come to Goa. So I think none of these is what we're talking about. We don't want travel. We're not asking for travel advisories, and we do not want to deny the existence of sexual violence. So these are things I think that we need to steer clear of and make sure that we don't fall into either of these binaries.
No, I think that's quite right. But I would also sort of add that, you know, Goa, I'm speaking to the choir here, is very different from the rest of India, institutionally, historically. And as my friend Benny has coined a wonderful phrase, Goa is a colony of a post-colony, right? So I think when we think about the contemporary formations of sexuality, how sexuality is being policed on the one hand, but is also used as a bait to draw in foreign tourism, etc. We also want to think about the long history of Portuguese colonialism. Goa was not liberated till 1961, as all of you obviously know, enduring one of the longest empires, and the Portuguese colonial state had very different understandings of sexuality vis-a-vis the natives than there were in British India. My first book was of British India, and I spent the last 15 years studying Portuguese India, and what has become apparent to me is that the differences, particularly in the 18th and 19th century, are quite dramatic. The anti-Devadasi laws, for example, that are passed in the Bombay Presidency, etc., don't come to take place in Goa till much later. So what does this do? So for example, when I was doing my research, a wonderful scholar who helped me, Mrs. Archana Kakorkar, who is a retired librarian, was very keen that we go to the southern part of Goa, because she said, look Anjali, there is a Devasthan there, but there are Devadasis there. And I was a bit embarrassed, and I said, look, I don't really want to go intrude on these people, but she was very insistent. So we went to this Devasthan, in which there were two Devadasis from our community who were about 80 years old and still lived on the outskirts of the Devasthan. So I went in to speak to them, and they were willing to speak to me because I was also a member of the Samaj. And so I said to them, you know, why are you still living here? The Devadasi custom is over. They had children who were living in the cities who were willing to take them. And they looked at me and said, you know, Anjali, we were forced into these traditions when we were young, but now we have developed our own relationship to the Devi, and we want to keep serving her. Now bear in mind, to this day, they have not entered the inner circle of the Devasthan. They were never actually seen the Devi, because according to the older rules, they were only allowed to be in the periphery of the Devasthan, right? So then I asked them, well, what happened during liberation? Why were you not liberated? And they said, oh, we were too far away. People always speak about colonial rule, but they talk about certain places of Goa and not the peripheries. So neither the Goan liberation nor the reformers from the Samaj arrived at this Devasthan. Right? So there are all these very interesting stories, but they're more complicated. This is a story of these two women who were coerced into being Devadasis through the change ceremony, etc., but then developed their own relationship to divine labor, etc., which outmanned or outmarched their understanding of sexuality, right? So these are the kinds of complicated, nuanced stories that we need to pay attention to, right? Otherwise, we do disservice. We just spectacularize sexuality. We make it a big story that everyone wants to talk about, when in fact it's everywhere and nowhere. We have a prime minister who's celibate, has abandoned his wife. We have the RSS that walks around in very short chaddis. So you know masculinity and celibacy is writ large in the national spirit. But the relationship to Goa is different. This history is very different and very nuanced.
I'm reminded of also, I think the point that you raise about Goa's difference in comparison to the rest of India because of Portuguese colonization is something that's really important for us to think about. Primarily with the Samaj and the work that the community did with Portuguese law. So Anjali, with Mikon by Yunko, where they actually sort of like worked with the Portuguese administration to kind of fashion their own sense of self, and then also, correct, where they basically said, you know, if the Portuguese are not going to defend us, then we're going to march over to British India, right? So this is something that shows us the ways in which Goa is very different, right, you know, all the way through. But I think in the contemporary moment, what's important to pay attention to is the ways in which these differences become productive. So because Goa was Portuguese, it's thought of as being more European, more like sexually, so on and so forth, and it then develops into this pleasure periphery for the rest of India, where this idea of sexuality, if it's not even directly sexual, is economically viable, right? For tourism and so on and so forth. And we can think of the ways this is similar to other parts of the world, so Hawaii to the United States or Puerto Rico, places where there are also military bases, in much the same way that Goa is a naval outpost for India. So there's kind of like a correlation to be drawn there between sexuality, economics, and empire and the army as well.
Someone asked me when I did an interview for the Navin Times, one of the questions was, you know, why is sexuality such a taboo subject? And the only thing I could respond is, by the very fact that you're asking me that question, it means sexuality is never taboo. It's present in its absence. The more you say you're not going to talk about it, the more you are talking about it, right? So that's the contradiction in which we live now. We don't want to, we have kisses erased out of James Bond. What's James Bond without a good kiss? But, right, the erasure of the kiss then calls attention to sexuality rather than erases its presence, right? So you want to think about this relationship between absence and presence, and I think that's what Albertina began with when she said, do you have boyfriends or do you not, right? I was going to impose on Albertina because she has enormous legal expertise and ask her to perhaps give us an example of a case or a recent event in which, you know, the question of sexuality was one that became the point around which people were struggling. In Bombay, the case of the bar dancers, which Flavia Agnes has written about, became this very, very important point, which I had small repercussions in Goa, but not so much, which was the case of bar dancers who were banned from bars but were allowed to perform at private residences of very wealthy people. So the question that a lot of the bar dancers argued was, we're doing the same the same Hindi film dances that someone who's doing an item number in a film is doing. So why are we being legislated against, and why are these major Hindi film actresses not, right? So there are these correlations that many people are drawing.
I just want to talk about something because that's sort of hitting me because it's just happened yesterday. I mean, you must have heard of this. This is not a Goan case, but it's a case of another, you know, that is Suzette Jordan, who was known as this Park Street, I mean anonymously known as a Park Street rape victim, and around whom there were always these tropes of being this person of this particular Anglo-Indian or some origin. Just like, there are these imageries about Goans and all that. And the battle that she fought, because it's like, how could a mother have been going out at night, to a discotheque? So therefore, if you are a mother and you go out to a discotheque at night, it means it's an invitation for sexual violence. You cannot express yourself. You cannot have any space. So, I think that's similar to also the kinds of experiences we have here. So I still remember this entire gang rape case where the woman was going out with these. She had gone out with these men, and she was friendly with one of them, and she'd gone out with them, and then they kind of took her away and gang raped her. And then the question was that, but she went out with them, So, I mean, what are you saying? And they put her through a whole lot of trauma, and society generally justified it as that woman is like that only. That's the kind of expression we use out here, like she's like that only. So then we really need to think about this, that, again, why are we conflating sexuality with sexual violence? Why are we seeing sexuality, an expression of sexuality or an expression of oneself, as a license to sexual violence? This is something I'd really like to bring to the table.
Maybe I'll say one thing and we'll take a couple of questions with Egg. So I just want to point out that I was in Bombay at the Times of India Literary Festival, a mere shadow of this wonderful event. And I went to a wonderful panel on law and inequality, and one of the comments one of the legal theorists made, and we have Jason Fernandez here who is more conversant with these issues, but that section 377 that everybody's worked up about is not just about gays. It's about unnatural behavior that is against procreation, which I'm assuming a lot of you who are consensual and adults are having, and not just gay people, right? So it's about non-penile penetration, which is not something that only gay people do, right? Or trans people do. So when you think about section 377, you want to think about, if you Google it, the immediate response will be homosexuals, etc. But section 377 is about unnatural sexual behavior. It's about the government being in your private affairs, right? Literally and metaphorically. So what we have to do, if you really are interested in questions of sexuality, is think about, how does section 377 become only about gay people? Why does third gender only become about hijras? There are many people in India who are third gender who are not hijras, right? So these conflations that Albertina and Bene are talking about are things that we need to undo, right? Sexuality is about race, sexuality is about what we do with our past, sexuality is also about how we configure sexual violence. All right, so I think we have a few minutes, maybe we'll take a couple of questions. We'll take a comment in search of the question as well, as long as it's brief.
I prefer questions.
Good morning. It was a really insightful conversation we had up there. I might have to tread into some politically incorrect territory, so please...
Every time you say that, you're making sure you can't do it. Go ahead.
Thank you. I wanted to know the distinction between objectification and empowerment. Now, when you speak about women acting in films or in advertisements which objectify their body, say you associate a woman with a beer or a woman with a soft drink, or even in films where they have to perform in item numbers, or in strip clubs, say in Nevada where, or prostitution, say, and even the dance bars that you mentioned earlier. The men going to these dance bars, or the men watching these films, they are objectifying the women. But the women who are participating in these are being empowered. They are earning their money, so it's like financial empowerment, and it's also their choice to do it. So it's telling them not to do it would be violating their integrity, or asking them to cover up would be violating their bodily integrity. So where do you draw the line between objectification and empowerment? Objectification of men by women and empowerment of women. through these acts that they can involve themselves in.
I can share with you a kind of a discussion we had at the time when there were these commercial carnival, I mean they still are the commercial carnival parades, but they were the parades where women would dance and throw flying kisses to the crowd. Now, we were clearly, there were different kinds of opponents to this at that time. At one level, the Shiv Sena was opposing it. How can women throw flying kisses to the crowd? Okay, now, and on the other hand, the church was opposing it, saying carnival is a pagan festival, and this is all what you call free functioning or whatever, And on the other hand, women's groups were opposing it. And what were we saying? We were continuously asserting the right of the woman to dance, but we were saying, don't commodify that as a means to attract tourism by making it seem that this is an object that you can get. So we are distinguishing between the empowerment and the right of the woman to her freedom of expression vis-a-vis the commodification for commercial interests.
Question of mine. We have a wonderful events and Anjali. Unfortunately, Albertina will not be able to be here any further, but both Anjali and Benny will be here. So you'll be able to conduct these conversations as well outside, and I hope you continue to do that. One more question, please.
So, so as a student of gender studies, we've read a lot of literature where the colonized country is always feminized, and the colonizer has this masculine identity. So it's there in case of India, America, and specifically Bengal as a state in India. But are there instances where Goa was feminized in any form of literature when the Portuguese colonized the state? Anything that comes to your mind?
Yeah, I'm thinking of the play Goa by Asif Kurumboy, where he represents Goa at different periods of time through different characters, and it's this contest basically between this woman and her daughter, and these two lovers who are interested in the daughter.
I would also add that it's important not to think about it just as colonized and colonized. Think about the idea of Bharat Mata. Right? So I think the Indian elite and the subaltern studies group, Shahid Amin will be talking about this, not this, but he's part of that collective, produce the same violence when they sort of critique the colonial elite for using this metaphor of masculinity and femininity, right? What does it mean to say Mera Bharat Mata or to refer to the motherland? All of these things. So these feminizations have worked in the colonial and post-colonial moment, right? So our job is to interrogate what work does that femininity do, right? Femininity allows you to search and rescue. Whenever you watch a bad film and the ship is sinking, what do they say? Women and children first, right? Why? The first thing you should think about is why? Are women necessarily weaker? It's a standardized form, which I think is what Ben is saying as well, that writers have tried to grapple with. But it's a great question.
The language movement as well, Konkani Mai, right? So that's something that still happens. Yeah.
Thank you so much for an